This is what Viking warriors dreamed of. Valhalla, feasts with the gods, songs of victory echoing across frozen fjords. Now this is what their enemies' wives faced when the longships arrived. No feasts, no songs, no gods waiting to welcome them, only screams, fire, and chains. Being conquered by the Vikings wasn't just about losing a battle. It was about losing your entire world. Your husband slaughtered before your eyes. Your home burned to ash. Your children dragged away, crying. And you were spared. But only because you were worth something alive. To the Vikings, you weren't a woman anymore. You were a thrall, a body to be sold, used, or sacrificed. A living prize for their victory. While the sagas glorify their bravery and conquest, there's another story, a darker one, written in the blood and tears of those they enslaved. Because what the Vikings did to the wives of conquered enemies wasn't just cruel, it was something far worse. It was the kind of horror that made death look like mercy. And in this video, we will explore it all. Welcome back to my channel. Tell us the country you are watching from. Please like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification.
For Odin, charge!
It always began with a sound. That deep, rhythmic splash of oars cutting through cold northern waters. The heartbeat of death drawing closer. Villages along the English and Frankish coasts knew it well. By the time they saw the dragon-headed ships gliding out of the morning mist, it was already too late. The Vikings didn't just attack, they descended. Men with braided hair and iron axes stormed through doors, setting fire to everything that stood. They struck with terrifying precision, killing warriors first, cutting down anyone who dared resist. But the women were not killed. They were cornered, dragged from their homes, their screams drowned by the roar of burning thatch and the clash of steel. The lucky ones died quickly. The others were forced to watch husbands and sons fall, their world collapsing in front of them. The Vikings had no mercy, not because they were monsters without feeling, but because terror itself was their weapon. Each raid wasn't just about gold or land. It was a message: resist and your world burns. And for the women captured, the real nightmare began after the flames died. Bound and bruised, they were herded toward the longships, thrown into the hulls among stolen treasures, livestock, and the spoils of war. As the sails rose and the coast faded behind them, they weren't prisoners of a moment, they were prisoners of fate. The voyage north wasn't a journey. It was a descent straight into the hell that awaited them in the lands of the Vikings. When the longships finally docked, the horror didn't end. It evolved. The captured women were dragged off the ships like loot, their wrists raw from ropes, their eyes empty from sleepless nights. They were marched into the Viking slave markets, places like Hedeby, Birka, and Dublin, where human lives were bartered like grain. Here, beauty became a curse. The fairer and more striking a woman was, the higher her price. Traders circled like wolves, inspecting every scar, every tear-streaked face. They didn't see humans, they saw value. A young noblewoman could fetch more silver than a chest of weapons. But the price wasn't just silver, it was her soul. The markets were loud and cruel. The air smelled of sweat, sea salt, and despair. Some women screamed for mercy, others stood still, their minds already broken. They were displayed half naked to show their health, prodded and humiliated before jeering crowds. There was no escape, no dignity, no future, only the certainty that whoever bought them would own them entirely. The strongest were sent to work the fields and grindstone. The weakest, or the most beautiful, became personal property concubines, servants, and sometimes offerings for darker purposes. In Norse lands, they were called thralls. But the word meant more than slave. It meant the living dead, one whose life no longer belonged to her. Every woman who stepped off those ships carried two burdens: the weight of chains on her wrists and the unbearable truth that death might have been kinder. For many enslaved women, their nightmare did not end with being sold. It was only beginning. In Norse society, slaves were not merely workers. They were tools, possessions, and sometimes offerings to the gods. The line between the living and the dead was thin, and for a thrall, it could vanish overnight. One of the most terrifying fates was to be chosen as a sacrifice, a human offering during funeral rites or religious ceremonies. The Vikings believed that a great chieftain should not enter the afterlife alone. A slave, often a young woman, would be forced to join him in death. The Arab traveler, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed such a ritual among the Rus Vikings, described it in chilling detail. After days of feasting, drinking, and chanting, a young slave girl volunteered or was coerced to die with her dead master. She was given intoxicating drinks, lifted high above the crowd, and declared she would see her lord again. But what followed was horror. By several men as part of the ritual, strangled with a rope, and stabbed to death by the priestess. Her body was then laid beside her master, before both were burned together on a ship. To the Vikings, this was an honor. To the enslaved, it was unspeakable. Imagine knowing your death was a spectacle, your final breath a ritual for someone else's glory. Others weren't sacrificed, but lived what could only be called a slow death, years of forced labor, hunger, and abuse. They woke every day knowing freedom would never come. The scars on their backs told stories no songs ever would. The women of the conquered didn't just lose their homes, they lost their humanity. If there was one thing worse than slavery, it was being forced to bring new life into it. For the women captured by the Vikings, their future and their children's was stolen before it began. Once enslaved, many women were forced to become concubines or war wives. These weren't relationships of love or choice, they were trophies of war, constant reminders of defeat. A frilla, as the Vikings called her, could bear her captor's children, but even that didn't free her. Her children would belong to their father's household, not her. If the man was wealthy, the child might grow up free. But if not, that child was born into bondage. Another link in the unending chain of servitude. For some women, the horror was worse. They were forced to raise the children of the same men who had murdered their families. Every child's face was a reminder of what they'd lost: their village, their people, their name. Imagine holding your newborn and knowing he would grow up calling his father master. That was the cruelest punishment of all. To the Vikings, this wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. By taking the women and erasing their heritage, they erased entire cultures. A conquered people's identity could vanish within a generation. No stories, no songs, no memories, only silence. Even death couldn't undo the pain. Without proper Christian burials, many women believed their souls would wander forever, lost between worlds. No heaven, no peace, just an eternity of drifting shadows. For the women taken by the Vikings, survival wasn't mercy, it was a curse. They weren't just robbed of their freedom or faith, they were robbed of their future. To die quickly was mercy. To survive the Vikings was hell. For the men who fell defending their homes, death was an ending, swift, brutal, but honorable. But for the women left behind, their torment was only beginning. They were dragged from burning houses, torn from their families, and forced to live in a world where every breath was a reminder of what they'd lost. In the Christian lands, the Vikings raided England, Ireland, and Francia. Faith was everything. To die without last rites was believed to condemn your soul to eternal damnation. For captured women, this fear became reality. They were denied burial, denied their faith, and forced to serve the same pagans they had been taught were agents of Satan himself. Every day was a desecration of their body and their soul. Worse still was the erasure of identity. Once enslaved, a woman lost her name, her lineage, her past. She became a possession spoken of in terms of trade value or beauty, not humanity. Her story ended the moment she was taken, replaced by silence in history's record. For these women, there was no hope of redemption, no path to freedom. Even in death, their spirits were trapped, unburied, forgotten, and forsaken. The Vikings didn't just conquer their bodies, they conquered their very existence. So when people say what the Vikings did to the wives of conquered enemies was worse than hell, it isn't exaggeration. Hell, at least, was imagined as an afterlife for the sinful. What these women endured was hell on earth, crafted by human hands, carried out in daylight, and remembered only in fragments of horror told across generations.